actually get to talk about Jewish works at all because I teach Christianity and poetry usually. I brought some of that here, but it's been really great for me to get to share some of these things with you. And as you recall, the first week that I was here, 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about sacred places. We looked at poems that were set in church and at the Western Wall. Last week we talked about sacred moments, and we saw a poem about a Sunday and a poem about Yom Kippur, and we had a little bit of disagreement about whether those were sacred moments or not, and that's my favorite kind of conversation about the poems, because I think that's what we all have to bring. And in some ways, tonight's gets even a little bit harder, and I expect even more debate tonight because the poems that I brought in are all about questioning, or what I think are poems about questioning. In some ways, you could actually say all the poems that we've read so far are about questioning, and I think in some ways you could say all poems are about questioning, and maybe really all literature and all arts are about questioning. So depending on how you want to define that category, you can have larger and larger circles of what's included. But I actually think in particular, and this is how I'm going to end tonight, so I'll give you the spoiler alert now so you can think about the question in advance, that something in particular about the modern condition, about the 20th and 21st centuries, leads to questioning, makes us ask questions, and you can think about whether you agree with that statement, and what about the modern condition leads to questioning. So that we can talk about that at the end of the evening and see if that sort of brings together the 3 weeks of poems that we've looked at. Is there something particular about questioning, especially questioning faith, in the modern world as opposed to in earlier times? Often people will generalize and say, in an earlier time, faith was simpler, or even life was simpler, right? And so I wonder if you believe that that's true, and if these poems seem to demonstrate that it's true. I'm going to start with Division Street. So if you see that one, it's got a line through the middle of the page, and I'll tell you why after we've read it. We're not actually going to spend so much time below the line, but I wanted to include that for you. Oh, I think some people didn't get a sheet. Maybe you can hand a couple over in case people missed them at the door. Thank you. So this is a very recent poem. This is from just a couple years ago, or a year ago, and it's called Division Street by Elise Passion. And I'm going to read this one, and then I think that this may be where we have the most debate about tone, but I could be wrong. So think about the tone of this poem. What is she aiming to say here? Because I think it's very deliberately ambiguous, and it may be saying two things at once, and those things may actually be mutually exclusive. And that's something that poets try to do sometimes. They play with us a little bit in that way. Division Street. The spire of Holy Name Cathedral rose like a prayer above Chicago Avenue. I thumbed a leather-bound book in catechism class, recited the Hail Mary. Fire and devils blazed at night. The nuns told my mother I had a calling. On Scott Street, a man lay shot dead in our alley. It was the Gold Coast. They prided themselves on sidewalks safe as shrines. I questioned God, the last to leave the room. Riots flared in Cabrini Green that Sunday. I didn't actually read the epigram, which I could. Prayer book and mother shot themselves last Sunday, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. But obviously, for those of you who know your geography, this is a Chicago poem, very Chicago poem. And I guess I'll ask you to start by saying what you think the tone is. And by tone, I guess I mean, is she angry? Is she prayerful? Is she regretful? There are lots and lots and lots of choices here. But what's the tone? Yes?
I think she's sort of frightened that the security she expected to find in church and with God is belied by the street shootings, even in her own neighborhood.
Okay, good. So she's frightened and maybe surprised or disillusioned, right? Does that capture sort of what you're getting to? Yeah, okay, sure.
I thought she was, I mean, to me, she's just thoroughly confused. Life is supposed to go in a certain pattern and rhythm, and it's been shattered, and she hasn't a clue why.
Okay, good. So there's that confusion too, which I think does fit with that idea of disillusionment as well, right? To have both of those together. There's an expectation, and that expectation isn't being met. And that feels very confusing, especially to a child. And you see that this is a poem told in past tense from an adult's perspective, but thinking about her child's self. Right? So there are a couple really interesting things about this poem that are worth considering more closely. One is the idea of the title, Division Street, right? So that's literal. There is a division street, and it divides the city. But why do you think she calls the poem Division Street? Is there some larger reason, Fred?
Well, it's a split poem. I mean, as you said rightfully, you don't know if she's young, old, but also the poetry itself, it's lines break, they move, you go from frame A to frame Z and back and forth. So,
Good.
You know, clearly, since I missed the first two classes,
okay.
I'm trying to get a better grade. As you said, it's both literal, but it's beautifully divided.
Right, good. So it's divided, and it's divided between a bunch of things, as you say. And if you notice, it's almost every other line, right? We have something that feels like a very holy opening. The spire of Holy Name Cathedral rose like a prayer. I mean, what a beautiful image, right? And not confusing at all. That's what a church should look like. It should look like a prayer, or rise like a prayer. And even the image of the prayer rising, right, suggests a kind of unity in the first line. And the thumbing the leather-bound book in catechism class and reciting the Hail Mary, these are all things that she should be doing, and that she believes in, and that feel of a piece. But then fire and devils blazed at night is quite a division from what came before. And then we go right back immediately. The nuns told my mother I had a calling. That seems to be connected to the first two sentences, but not to the third. And then this very jarring image, on Scott Street, a man lay shot dead in our alley. It was the Gold Coast. That one you could read a couple of different ways. It was the Gold Coast, right? There's a literal meaning there, but also I think it has some suggestions of something of value, and maybe also a place of danger. Then who's they? They prided themselves on sidewalks safe as shrines?
Residents of the Gold Coast.
Yeah, maybe the residents of that neighborhood, yeah.
You know, when you walk or drive through Chicago, you're impressed by the incredible number of very large, impressive churches.
Yes.
Roman Catholic churches.
Absolutely.
Built by the poor residents, Polish, Ukrainian, whatever. And yet, despite the wealth poured into those churches, you can see essentially still a poor, violent city.
Right.
And that there's a conflict.
And there is that dichotomy, and in some ways this really captures the sense of Chicago in that way. There are a number of great Chicago poets who try to capture exactly what you're describing there. But also think about the church being on one side of Division Street and the home being on the other, right? And do you see that that's a possibility here, that she's going back and forth? So they, who prided themselves on sidewalks safe as shrines, is on one side of Division Street, and Cabrini Green is on the other. You're familiar with Cabrini Green? So it's a very dangerous housing project.
You know, I just want to tell you, seeing as I'm a New Yorker and I don't know Chicago at all, the first thing that hit me is Division Street's on the Lower East Side.
Right,
And
yeah.
the name is a Cabrini Boulevard.
Right, that's true.
I'm looking at this and saying, I don't know what she's
Where is this place? That's where the confusion comes from. This doesn't sound like New York. What's going on here? Yeah, right. You're right. There are those neighborhoods. So Cabrini Green, if you're interested, there are actually some great books, and there's one in particular called There Are No Children Here, which is a work of journalism about the lives of children in Cabrini Green at the worst of the drug-related gang violence. And it's
the largest housing project in the country.
That's right. It is. And
It's still up?
it is still there. Yeah. I think it has improved somewhat in recent years, but there was a period when it was one of the most dangerous places. It's certainly known in Chicago as this terrible, terrible place. So if you think about Division Street as almost running through the middle of the poem, but also through the middle of the speaker's life, right, then what does that do with her life on one side of the division and her faith on the other? Right? And I guess her life probably exists in both. So maybe what I should say is her home on one side and her church on the other, right? And crossing that division. One of the things that's so interesting about this poem is exactly what Fred pointed out, that back and forth, which is really disillusioning to her and very confusing, but also adds up to sort of one life of a person who has to cross a division that's really stark. And then the questions that it raises, and what we need to talk about then is the the sentences that I didn't read, right, the hard ones. I questioned God the last to leave the room. So one of the things I love about poetry is the complexity of the grammar, and this is a sentence with very complex grammar. So give me two options for what that sentence could mean. Yes, what's one?
Could be God was the last to leave the room.
Yes, or,
I was the last.
that's right, and that's very intentional, right? To have, I questioned God, there we have our two nouns, the last to leave the room. And it could be, I stayed after Sunday school to question God, right? Everyone else had left and I stayed. But it could also be, who was the last to leave the room? It could be God was the last to leave the room. And each of those, I think, provides a really different meaning to what that line could be, and the ambiguity is very intentional. So what's the effect of having a line that doesn't tell you exactly what it means? This is a pretty common Jewish experience, actually, so it shouldn't feel that foreign.
It allows you to argue forever.
It allows you to argue forever, that's fun, right? So it could be that. It gives you anxiety. If there's a test, but here, no test, so you're fine. I think it also, well, for me, two things. One is it shows the richness of the language and how many possibilities lie in our use of words that we don't even often attune to. We recognize it when we misunderstand each other, but other than that, we sort of slide past using language. And a line like that really helps to point out how ambiguous the language can be and how not fixed it is. So that's one thing, that's sort of on the formal level. But also says that maybe those two things can exist simultaneously or can alternate with each other. So what does it mean for her to be the last to leave the room? I think it suggests a kind of searching, right? I kind of hope to end that disillusionment, to say I can make all of these pieces fit together. You know, everyone else is just doing their rote thing, but I'm really searching. So that's one possibility. But
The nun said she had a calling.
yeah,
She loved it so much, she didn't want to leave.
that's right. So it says something really interesting about her character, especially given the experiences that we know she's having elsewhere or at other times of day.
Even if you read it as God.
Yes, what does it do then?
To leave the room.
Right.
She also has to be there, just to the question. So she's also going
Right.
to be there.
But it does
She
suggest,
was the last one.
Right.
Obviously.
that's right, but wait, right, exactly. But if we mean it as God was the last to leave the room, or if she means it that way, then it says something about her faith, right? More than about maybe her identity, that she believes that even after she leaves, God remains, right? And that's also kind of a profound statement, that she's now left, and she's going back where? Riots flared in Cabrini Green that Sunday. I don't think that's accidental that that follows immediately after the last to leave the room. And so if God stayed in the church, gosh, it has a couple different suggestions, doesn't it? Right, Matt? Give us some.
If he's in the church, he's not in the room.
That's right, yeah. Did he stay in the room?
This reminds me of Auden's Musée de Beaux Arts in the sense that what kind of responds to it in a certain sense.
This is a ringer, my former English major student.
Well, just right there, you have, you know, some calamity going on in one place and a peaceful scene in another, and
Right.
the two, you know, don't meet. Right? Here,
Yeah.
she's forcing the issue. She's saying,
That's right. You have to meet.
In one place. and
Right, absolutely.
in the other, but I can't separate.
Very good. So the Auden poem, for those of you who aren't familiar, is actually, it's called Musée de Beaux Arts, and it's a description of the Bruegel painting in which Icarus is just disappearing. Do you know this Bruegel? It's an amazing painting, and you see this, you know, really common sort of Dutch landscape, the water, lots of people around, and someone pulling an ox cart, and in the water you just see two little legs sticking up, and it's Icarus having fallen from flying too close to the sun. And then Auden, I mean, it's an amazing painting, and then Auden writes this amazing poem about it, saying how life goes on around this kind of amazing thing that happened. You know, there's Icarus falling, and everyone's just doing their thing. But you're right, in that poem, Auden really keeps the two separate. And his observation there is that people just sort of go on. And what Passion does is take those two, I don't know, it's not binary exactly, but these, you know, these things that feel very different mood, and juxtaposes them in a way that you can't separate them, and says, you readers, you can't just let the life go on, right? Look at what's happening here. And so if God remained, it might be a statement of deep faith, right? God was the last one in the room. God was always there. It might be a statement of deep doubt. God stayed in the room and I had to go back out there, right? So that one by itself can be read in a couple ways, but then we have the possibility that she was the last one in the room, and that speaks to the line about having a calling and really trying to search. So what we're left with here is a poem that seems very much to be about religion and faith, and that also suggests simultaneously, and I really think intentionally, faith and doubt. Right? Sorry, you look like you're not buying it.
Well, our entire lives are built on that dichotomy, frankly.
Sure.
I think partially she says that God was there. He may not. He would be the last to leave the room only because his presence would be there eternally.
Right.
So in a sense,
Right.
he's not leaving, and he's
Right.
if you knock, I will answer kind of concept.
Maybe, but is he in Cabrini Green? Is he in the alley?
Not that Sunday.
Not that Sunday. Okay. So you feel more confident about it. I feel a little more, it could go either way, not sure. Like if she really has such deep faith, does the faith only exist in the church? And when she steps outside, the faith is gone? That doesn't feel totally like faith to me.
You know what this really reminds me of?
What?
Was it the front page of the New York Times today? This
No, I didn't.
scene of devastation
Oh,
in the Philippines. We've seen it in Haiti, we've seen it in Japan, we've seen it this morning.
Yeah.
We saw it, but not with that kind of human loss. Not that kind of human loss.
Right, that was thousands, tens of thousands, I said, yeah.
And it's like, oh, again.
Right, right.
That's the feeling I
Yeah,
get.
interesting. Right.
So to me, this is today's.
It's speaking to that, yeah. Right, absolutely. And here she's talking about individuals, not, massive, say, natural disasters. This is about human violence. But it doesn't necessarily take away, especially from the child's experience, right, of that devastation. Absolutely. So I have one other thing I want to point out about this poem before we move on to another one, but you wanted to say something, so.
Well, her mother said she had a calling. The nun told my mother that I had a calling. It's like she's not so sure about herself.
That's right. Good. Other people think so.
And
Yeah.
she's thumbing during the catechism class, she's holding on to the Bible, and it starts off with the spire.
Right.
And then suddenly juxtapose that as to what's happening. Is that,
Right.
wait a second,
Absolutely.
is this really where I want to go?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that in some ways what we're left with in this poem is a really deep I don't know, right? This child could probably go either way. And there's something pretty profound about that, I think, of capturing that experience and not following through on it for us, so that we kind of have to guess at it.
We don't know what her life experience is going to be ahead of her.
That's right, and she doesn't either, and that's part of the frustration of this. It's there's a division through the middle, and there are options on either side. So the other thing I want to point out is there are a bunch of famous Chicago poets. Probably the most famous of them is Carl Steinberg, but Passion, who's also a Chicago poet, chooses instead to reference Gwendolyn Brooks. Is anyone familiar with Gwendolyn Brooks? She's a really interesting poet, and also very known for Chicago poems, and also for poems especially about violence in poor neighborhoods. And if you notice the quote that she starts with, "Prayer book and mother shot themselves last Sunday," I included below the line there a little excerpt from Gwendolyn Brooks' poem called "A Man of the Middle Class," which had been written about 40 years earlier. That includes that line. I have antique firearms, blackamoors, Chinese rugs, ivories, bronzes, everything I wanted. But have I answers? Oh, methinks I have answers such as have the executives I copied long ago, the ones who, forfeiting Vic's salve, prayer book, and mother, shot themselves last Sunday. So it's very cryptic, this, but obviously also very dark. And it's so interesting that Passion takes that line out of context this way, because who shot themselves last Sunday? Well, it's the executives I copied long ago. It's very confusing. But I want to just show you something that Passion did. I don't know if anyone noticed it, but if you look at the last word of every line, it says, prayer book and mother shot themselves last Sunday. So she's really trying to build this Gwendolyn Brooks poem and the darkness of it, and Brooks's use of the violence of Chicago into her poem by actually using it as the final word of each line. And you could have that epigram at the beginning and not even notice that she's done that with the poem. Right? And this is something someone asked me a couple weeks ago about how I stop at the punctuation and not at the line breaks. And in part, it's that reason, right? Because then there's a sort of secret to find. You get the meaning when you read by the punctuation, and then you can look at the poem and see what else is there and where the poet chooses to put line breaks. I'm not sure I can fully explain to you what she's doing, but I actually had a student take this poem and map it out on a physical map of Chicago. Where would the church have been? Where's Cabrini Green? Where did Division Street go through? And where was Brooks's poem set? And they were all making up a sort of oval on the map. It's really interesting, yeah.
The odd thing about the line in the Gwendolyn Brooks poem is that it says forfeiting Dick Sav for her mother. That's such an odd...
It's such an odd image, absolutely.
Which Passion sort of leaves out in her use of it.
Yeah, right, it's true. It would be a very different poem if it started with Vic Sav, right? Yeah, I think it was a wise decision to start where she did. But she also took Brooks's poem, which isn't overtly religious, and made a very religious, or at least potentially religious poem out of it. Yeah.
Mother is capitalized.
Yes. Right, it is.
Is that significant?
I don't know. It could be. I mean, I think my sense of Brooks is, in that case, that she's using it as a proper noun, not as anything sort of bigger than that. What?
But other proper nouns are capitalized.
Other proper
German
nouns.
they are, but not in English. And not.
Oh, right. No, I mean, I think she's using it to address, like, to talk about a specific person, mother. Right, using it as a name as opposed to mothers generally, where it would be lowercase. But it's hard to tell because she also has wanted capitalized. I mean, everything I wanted, as though that's like its own sort of proper statement. Yes?
I see Richard Corey here again.
Interesting, yeah.
I mean, some of the details are obviously
Right.
quite different,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole tone of the poem is different.
It is. Well, it doesn't have that ballad sensibility either.
But I mean, that's the first thing that springs to mind.
Is Richard Corey?
I see this.
Really? That's so interesting. I'll have to think about that more. I wonder if that's... She's thinking about that, right. Yeah. Although, how many ballads don't end like that?
Well, usually your heart's broken.
Right.
Or you shoot yourself.
Right, exactly. Right. So, if you're feeling thoroughly confused about this one, that's a perfect time to turn the page over. And let's look at the oxen. So you know that I work on Thomas Hardy. And I actually meant to bring copies of my book tonight, completely forgot. So if you're interested in the book, whatever, let me know, or you can find it on Amazon. But The Oxen is one of Hardy's poems that I think asks a lot of questions as well. Hardy's a very questioning poet. We're jumping back a bunch of years now, but Hardy's still modern in many ways. And I want to see what you think is going on in this one. It's also a poem that I think asks a lot of questions about faith. So that's sort of our theme for the night. The Oxen. Christmas Eve and 12 of the clock. Now they are all on their knees, an elder said as we sat in a flock by the embers in hearthside ease. We pictured the meek, mild creatures where they dwelt in their strawy pen, nor did it occur to one of us there to doubt they were kneeling then. So fair a fancy few would weave in these years. Yet I feel if someone said on Christmas Eve, "Come, see the oxen kneel in the lonely barton by yonder coombe, our childhood used to know," I should go with him in the gloom, hoping it might be so. Okay, so we can pull apart some of the harder language here. So fair a fancy few, because of all the alliteration, I think you can kind of lose the meaning of that one. So it's so fair a fancy, that is such a beautiful, imaginative dream, few would weave. That's how the structure of that line is broken up. Right, few would weave in these years. So someone summarize this one. What's going on here? Can someone give like a quick recap? Do you get it? I can do it if you don't get it, yeah.
It seems to me that this is somebody who remembers this Christmas story as a child.
Good, that's right.
The faith of a child.
Yes, just like what we saw in the previous one.
And wishes that they could recapture that feeling.
Perfect, absolutely. Well, we're going to talk about the wishes part, but the story is that as children, they were gathered around in a flock, not an accidental word choice, right? The children were gathered in a flock on Christmas Eve, and the elder said, now they're all on their knees. Who's the they? The oxen. Right, so have you heard this this story? So this is a sort of Christian mythology that at midnight on Christmas Eve, that the oxen themselves, all the animals, kneeled in the manger, right? So he's saying to the children, now they're all kneeling. And the children, we, and here's the past tense, pictured the meek, mild creatures where they dwelt in their straw pen. They pictured them kneeling. Nor did it occur to one of us there to doubt they were kneeling. We didn't doubt it at all. We were kids. This is what the elder told us. We totally believed it, right? 100% were bought into this. We were picturing it. Almost like it was magic, right? There was a magical feeling about it.
The word then.
Then is very important here. So he uses then to say, no, to doubt they were kneeling then, and it might mean at that moment on Christmas Eve, and it might mean as children, we wouldn't have doubted it, right? Exactly. And he, in case you didn't get it, says something very similar in the next stanza. So fair a fancy few would weave in these years, right? In these years being what? As adults, exactly. It doesn't mean in 1910 in particular, right? But in these years, as adults, we wouldn't have this kind of flight of fancy. We wouldn't weave this fanciful story about oxen kneeling at midnight. Yeah.
Hardy was the writer who, after writing half a dozen or so great novels, he was really maybe the leading novelist in the world, suddenly stopped doing that and wrote nothing but poetry for the next 20, 30 years.
More than that, absolutely. He wrote 14 novels. The last was Jude the Obscure, and then he wrote about 1,000 poems. And he lived to be 89, so he wrote poems for quite a long time after that. Yeah. What?
1928 did he die?
Yes, in 28, that's right. Yep, he died in 1928. So he wrote, about 1,000 poems. And it was not quite as clean a break as you describe. He'd actually been writing poems much earlier as well. He really did stop writing novels. But actually, he'd been writing poems since 1866. So
He apparently didn't like the reaction to Jude the Obscure.
he did not like the reaction to Jude the Obscure at all. It was very heavily criticized, and people called it Jude the Obscene. And he wasn't happy about that. And there's some discussion about whether his wife was so unhappy with it that she prompted him to stop writing novels then too. But actually, if you look back in his writings, he said even very early that he'd always wanted to be a poet. And after he'd written the 14 novels, he was sufficiently successful that he could kind of do whatever he wanted. And so he sort of retired to his home and called Maxgate and just wrote poems. But he had said all along that he wouldn't want to be remembered as a novelist, he'd want to be remembered as a poet. So it's hard to pull apart all of those different things that people say and figure out which ones are genuine and which ones are said for a moment or an interview or a circumstance, but that's what he said. So so this is Hardy. So you probably know some of his novels, right? Test of the D'Urbervilles is the most famous, but The Mayor of Casterbridge, Jude, Far from the Madding Crowd, like, exactly, yes. Yeah, I don't think most people know Woodlanders. Fred knows Woodlanders, right. So let's look at what happens after he says, so it's a poem like Division Street that's really split in half. Division Street weaves the parts together, and he kind of has his 2 stanzas about being a child and 2 stanzas about being an adult. And once we get to the adult stanzas, I think it gets much more complicated, as well it should, because what he's talking about, in fact, is how complicated it is to be an adult, especially an adult with faith, right? And what this poem suggests, at least in the first part, is how easy it is to be a child with faith, right? That these children sat there and the elder said it to them and they, yes, absolutely believed. Now, whether you agree with that or not, I think is probably a function of your own childhood and your experiences with children, but that's what Hardy's saying, I think. It didn't occur to one of us to doubt, right? And then we get to the adult stanzas. So fair a fancy few would weave in these years. Very few of us as adults would continue with that sort of belief. There are some, right? There are some who continue with that faith, but he's saying few. One of the ones who did was someone we read last week, Gerard Manley Hopkins, right? He never wavered. But Hardy's saying most adults, they start to become a little more skeptical, right? They wouldn't weave this fair fancy. Yet, and the yet is so important, I feel if someone said on Christmas Eve, come see the oxen kneel in the lonely barton by yonder coombe our childhood used to know, like that same place where we used to go as children and we believed that the oxen were kneeling, let's go over there now. I should go with him in the gloom, hoping it might be so. And that word hoping is gosh, so awesome. What is that? It contains so much meaning, I think, to say the hoping. And it really captures, I think, in the same way that last to leave the room has a lot of possibilities. In the Passion poem, I think the hoping has a lot of possibilities here. So what's one?
It's a return to innocence.
He's aiming for that return to innocence, right? I would love to be back in the first two stanzas, right? Just to have that moment where I believe wholeheartedly. But what else could it be?
He had a very odd personal life. He was married to one woman for a long time, and they fought all the time. He hated her. She dies. He then marries his lover, proposes to her on his first wife's grave, and then spends their marriage loving the dead wife and paying no attention to the new wife.
That is a pretty good description of what happened, yeah. She wasn't really necessarily his lover. There's a lot of debate about that. She was his secretary. And it's not clear that they had any kind of physical relationship at all. Some people think that they did. But yes, he and Emma did not get along well. It's really true. They really didn't. But then after she died, he regretted.
He worshipped her.
Yeah.
After she was dead.
Yeah, I mean, they had a good early relationship, but then most of it was bad. And then he regretted it. I mean, I don't know that there's another way to put it. He regretted it. And he wished that he had tried to mend things with Emma, but then he married Florence, who was very, very devoted. That was his secretary, who was much younger. And she took care of all his papers and all his correspondence and keeping visitors away, because he was very famous by that point, and people were constantly coming to the house, and she was chasing them away. And he was terrible to her. It's true, yes. But that's all very interesting. Does that have any, do you see that in the poem, or you were just sort of pointing it out?
Kind of a sort of a split personality.
Okay, so here's what I have to say about that, and you can totally disagree with me. I don't think it does. I think this is just totally human. I don't think you have to have a weird life to feel this way. I don't see the weird life in this. I think this is like, who doesn't feel like this, right? So, remember, were you here the first week when I said I don't like to do the biography? Okay, so the reason that I don't like...
Back to it, though.
You keep going back to it. It's true, you do. You're my biography guy. The reason that I don't like to read the biography into it too much is that I think it almost asks for that kind of reading, and I'm not sure the text does. I don't see it in the poem. And what we can say to ourselves is, oh, he was a wacko, and now let's find something wacko in the poem, right? And I think we do that all the time. Like, you know, when you go to the MoMA and you see Starry Night and you say, that guy totally cut his ear off, right? But but if you don't bring that to the work, I don't know if you'd see it there. I think the work is actually beautiful, and I think this one, maybe more than others even, it's so true to me. Like, this is not my religious experience, but that hoping it might be so is so my experience. Right? And so I don't know if I see it's because he was wacky. And also, frankly, I don't know how much wackier that is than any of us. Like, if you boil any of our lives down to, like, the most sort of National Enquirer style details, we all sound a little bit strange, right? I mean, pick out, like, the 2 sentences that someone would say about you if they were writing, like, the juiciest possible biography, and you kind of probably seem like a wacko too, although I don't know anything about you, so it's nothing personal. I'm just saying, like, I would seem like a wacko too, right? Because we all have these sort of weird details in our lives, because that's life. But if you actually think about Hardy's life, it wasn't all that unusual, I don't think. I mean, he did have strained relationships at times, but who doesn't?
Ruskin,
all the contemporaries do, like everybody, us. It's not just artists, it's people. People? It is, it's people. Everybody has a strange life in some way. So if you want to show it to me in the poem, I'm open to it. I don't see it in the poem. But what else could hoping mean? Fred, what else could hoping mean?
No, I've had the pleasure of talking to you about Marty so many times, and I'm going to ask you, it seems to me, the thing, I love about Marty is that Robert Frost, he has that quality of extraordinary simplicity
yes.
with a very dark vision.
Yeah, and also I think it's misleadingly simple. It's very simple on the surface, and then there's a lot underneath. Yeah.
But the line that's almost unbelievably miraculous, lonely garden, my yonder coombe, our childhood used to know. I mean, the reason that's miraculous, and you can say more, is it simply the sounds of the word.
Yes, absolutely.
You have to know them. They're all stressed with the vowel O.
Ooh, and oh, yeah.
You know, so you as a real professor of poetry, me as a fan, so but doesn't that get at the meaning of the poem? Those sound?
Absolutely.
Is that part of it that's built in?
Absolutely, I think it does. The music of the poem cannot really be separated from its meaning, I think. And ooh and oh and all of those, and the sibilant sounds, all of those, I think actually invoke something about childhood and comfort.
And pain, right? Don't you think the kind of pain that-
Interesting, that could
I don't know,
be. Yeah, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it like that, but it's possible. He also very purposely uses antiquated language there. I mean, by the early part of the 20th century, people weren't saying, in the lonely barton by yonder coombe. He was sort of invoking the language of his childhood as well. Yeah, Matt?
I think also, just connecting those 2 points, actually, your question and Fred's point, he's asking for the switch to be flipped from belief or faith to knowledge, right? To actually see something and know it's an empirical.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Happen, right?
Yeah.
But if you were to choose that within religion, this seems like a very, it seems like a strange moment to pick within Christology, right? Would you rather see Jesus, walk in water, right?
Right, you want to see the kneeling oxen, right? It's true. It's like a very tangential.
Would you pick seeing the Torah given at Sinai, or that, a rod turned into a snake in Pharaoh's palace, right? I mean,
Yeah. I don't know. Those both feel like this feels a lot more tangential to the story even than that one. Pick like a midrash or something,
Well, right, but exactly. So there is kind of something, even in that very real question or desire that we all have.
Right.
He's still choosing to do it
In a childlike way. And I think that that speaks to what the positive memory is for him. It's not of the tenets of the faith, it's of remembering what it was like to believe wholeheartedly in something, right? Yeah.
Wasn't he sitting in front of a manger scene? I can visualize him sitting in front of a manger scene.
It doesn't say that, it's possible.
Did it and made the oxen.
Oh, it's possible. I mean, it just says that they sat by the hearthside, so it's not clear that there's a manger there, but it's possible that they're actually looking at that one. When they say we pictured, I had always envisioned that as they pictured in their minds, not that they were literally looking. I think usually when you say we pictured, it means in our imaginations. But what's the hoping also say? He's hoping to return to his childhood, to this childlike state. He'd like to go and see it because he would hope that he could, as Matt says, sort of flip that switch and say, not just that he could believe it, but that he could know it to be true. But what does that hoping also imply? Do you see the other side of it?
Well, he clearly has lost a lot of faith.
Yeah.
And the image that keeps coming to me, I mean, we all were children once and spent a lot of time in imaginative play. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I miss it. There's a glow on the moment. There's a glow in your imagination. There's the absolute free reign of your imagination. I don't remember exactly when it ended, but
Right.
But
That's true.
that's really what I see him doing.
Yeah.
He remembers these things vividly because children are intense.
Right.
They're emotionally intense.
Right.
And he no longer can access
Right.
that, partially because he is an adult, partially because of the era,
Mm.
and partially because, this surrounding society is crushing this out of
Right, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is true in this. And it's interesting to me how much can be captured by so few words, right? And the hoping, I think, shows so much just that word choice as opposed to the other things that it could be, that he wants it, and he's so skeptical at the same time, or so suspicious that what he would find if someone did do that. I mean, there's a lot of ifs in this, right? If someone would suggest this, he's not going to do it himself. Someone needs to suggest it to him. And then if he went, and then if he could see it, and if he could get that feeling back, right? It's a lot of conditionals.
Did he have children?
He did not. He never had children. No.
When did you wrote this during Christmas time?
Yeah, I think he did, actually. I think he did. And he actually wrote a lot of Christmas poems, so that wasn't
Maybe
unique.
there's something, some ambivalence in terms of not having children.
Oh, interesting.
And
Maybe.
the atmosphere at the time.
Yeah.
that you had. And then maybe when Emma died, and you like to do a biography.
I know. Yeah, I know. I think he's trying to capture something more universal than just like, I wish I had children. It's like about the experience we all have of having been a child, right? And then it's great to watch children, and there are lots of wonderful poems about that too, but this is about the self. It's really a very self-focused poem. I want to recapture that feeling. I'm hoping it's so. But even there, he can barely get himself to say it. It's only hoping it might be so, right? That might, it's like hoping it would be so, but might is only, he can't muster even enough faith to say, I want to see it. He's like almost scared to go, because then the thing, and this is sort of the opposite of what Matt says, is does he want to flip the switch from hope to knowledge?
I think he wants an answer one way or the other.
I think he wants the answer one way and not the other. So I think that's why he's a little bit hesitant about, because it seems like there's almost a wish not to have knowledge, because if you have the full knowledge, you lose all the rest of it. You lose that hope.
You lose the magic.
Yeah. You lose the magic, exactly. If he goes and sees that they're not kneeling, he's lost all of this. The memory's gone too, in a way, right? Because then it just becomes a memory of ignorance. Here, by keeping it in this kind of suspended state, it allows it to still be a possibility. Right? So I think that he almost doesn't want the knowledge. I don't know. This is a place where we can differ. And in fact, there are so many wonderful different readings of what those last couple lines mean. And also why he includes gloom there. I mean, we'd like to think it's more than just because it rhymes with coom. The idea of going into the gloom, I mean, it could just mean darkness because it's midnight, but there's something else, I think, that's captured in the feeling there. Yeah, what did you want to say? The gloom of life? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
You said that he wrote novels, 16 novels.
14, yeah.
14, and then he started to write 1,000 poems.
Mm.
But if a person writes these wonderful novels, it's already poetic, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They're very related.
So
But
it wasn't
there's
such a big jump.
No, it's not like going from being a novelist to a sculptor or something where you're working in a different medium. But it's a very different process, and his poems tend to be very short and very heavily rhymed, and those are things that are quite different from the novels, which are not very short and obviously not rhymed. Yeah.
This last line again with some ambiguity.
Yeah.
In other words, that comma, okay, I should go with him in the gloom while hoping it might be so. Not hoping that it might be so.
Oh, not as an end result. It's while you're going, you have that hope. Nice.
I should like to go with him, still hoping, okay? It ends that.
And he stops there. Right. Interesting.
You're left.
Does everyone get what the distinction that he's making? That the hope is only in the process of the going, and that Hardy actually stops the poem before you get anywhere where you could see anything. That he's just like, I'd like to go while I'm hoping. That's actually a really nice reading. I like that a lot. That adds another possibility. All right, so we only have a few minutes left. Oh, it's crazy, it goes so fast. And this last poem I saved as the, yeah, sure.
What's a barton and what's a coombe?
Oh, okay. A barton is a field, like a meadow. And the coombe, what is that, a farmhouse? Or barn? Something with a farm.
You're right.
I think it's something, some structure on a farm. What? I think it is a reference to the manger, but it's saying like, over there, we should go that way. Yeah, right.
This is agricultural language from southeast England.
From Dorset.
1900.
Yeah, from Dorset. So it's really obscure language, but I think that that's what it is. I did look these words up at one point. Okay, so the culminating poem, the one that I saved for the end of everything, is this Deborah Garrison poem. And unfortunately, I appreciate that the copies were made to keep everything onto one page, but the line breaks are off here. So this is not how the line breaks go at the end, which is a little bit of a bummer. But if you want to see it, you can actually find that this poem was first published in the New Yorker 1 month after September 11th. And so you'll see why I included it here to talk about questions, and we'll talk about it for a few minutes, and then leave just a couple minutes to talk about the modern condition, because we can wrap that all up in a couple minutes. Okay. I saw you walking. I saw you walking through Newark Penn Station in your shoes of white ash. At the corner of my nervous glance, your dazed passage first forced me away, tracing the crescent berth you'd give a drunk, a lurcher, nuzzling all comers with ill will and his stench. But not this one. Not today. One shirt arm's sheared clean from the shoulder, the whole bare limb wet with muscle and shining dimly pink, the other full sheathed in cotton, Brooks Brothers type, the cuff yet buttoned at the wrist, a parody of careful dress, preparedness. So you had not rolled up your sleeves yet this morning when your suit jacket, Here are the pants, dark gray with subtle stripe, as worn by men like you on ordinary days. And briefcase, you've none, reverse commuter, come from the pit, with nothing to carry but your life, or torn from you, as your life was not. Your face itself seemed to be walking, leading your body north, though the age of the face, blank and ashen, passing forth and away from me, was unclear, the sandy crown of hair powdered white like your feet, but underneath, not yet gray. 47, 48, the age of someone's father. And I trembled for your luck, for your broad, dusted back, half-shirted, walking away. I should have dropped to my knees to thank God you were alive, oh my God, in whom I don't believe. So I think that this is the best poem written about September 11th. I think it's absolutely amazing, and I would like to know if you think that too, sort of what you see here, and how much she builds up to what is ultimately a really faith-based conclusion that leaves us, I think, with a lot of questions about faith in a way that very much capture exactly what you raised before about the question of disaster and response to disaster. Yes?
I gather she's reacting to a stranger.
A stranger, that's right.
A survivor of 9/11.
That's right.
Who she sees in the train station.
That's right.
And although she doesn't know who he is.
That's right.
She falls to her knees and thanks God.
She doesn't.
For him.
She doesn't. I should have. Yeah. That's right. Well,
May or may not be one.
yeah, maybe. And maybe she does or doesn't. It's hard to tell. So the description is obviously spectacular here, right? Just in capturing that we all experienced, right? In that moment, and the person, and seeing the person, right? In your shoes of white ash, right? And that image of the ash and the dust that keeps coming back, which of course in its reference to death is a religious image, and we all know it post 9/11, the image of dust as being related to death. But here she uses it, as this kind of dust to dust image. It's not very heavy-handed in its use, but it comes back so often, right? Can't even tell how old you are because of the gray, right? And the one arm, the arm ripped off the shirt, but the arm's still on the body. But let's talk about that ending, because I think actually the poem is pretty clear, and to me it's spectacular, but it's clear, right? That description, the use of the description, how the briefcase is included, how the jacket and the pants and these little details of a worker, right? Reverse commute, and says, come from the pit with nothing to carry but your life. All of that I think is clear. I think where the real question comes in is when she starts to talk about spirituality. And so let's look at that last bit. I should have dropped to my knees to thank God you were alive, oh my God, in whom I don't believe. So if we pull this apart, again, I think the grammar of the language, the way the language is used ambiguously, it says a lot of things at once. So you said, the God she doesn't believe in. Is everybody on the same page with that? No, why?
No, because it's like there are no atheists in foxholes.
Okay.
That's right. That's what I was
There's
saying. To thank God, and then she went, oh, wait a second.
Ah, so is it that all along she hasn't believed in God, but this event has, well...
She said she didn't, but...
She didn't say she didn't, she said I don't. It's not the same thing.
In whom I don't believe, but I don't believe that she didn't believe. This wouldn't have been the figure that she's...
So that's the circle of it, right? Unless that's what atheists do. No, it's not actually what atheists do. This is the circle that's going on in the poem, right? To say, oh my God, in whom I don't believe, right? And who is she speaking to? The God in whom she doesn't believe? What? And she knows, obviously, that there's that contradiction there. But I think also, like the oxen, it captures a very human experience. So if you're thinking she wasn't a believer before September 11th, but there are no atheists in foxholes, so in this moment of danger, she became a believer, that's one possibility. I think there's another one. She was a believer, and September 11th made that fall away, right? And yet, even in that moment of horror, when she stopped believing, she still saw little miracles, right? Like this man. And so, seeing this man who survived, a stranger, right? Her first thought is to go to God, right? So it could be that she wasn't a believer until then, but I think it's something probably even more complicated than either of those two possibilities, which is, I think what happens in disasters right? There are no atheists in foxholes is the statement that we know. But in disasters, isn't there a how could it be, and yet I believe, and how could it be, right? And I think that there's that sort of pulling back and forth. And you can think of whatever human or natural disaster you want to think of, but I think that that's a very natural reaction. Some people maybe go straight into belief from that. Some people fall completely away from belief in that moment. And I think that lots of people have this reaction, which is, I don't know how I can believe anymore, but I don't know how not to either. Right? And that's sort of what feels like happening here to me. But you tell me, is that what's happening for you? Yeah.
There's also a less dramatic explanation that millions of people say, oh my God, or thank
Good,
God.
yes.
Whether or not they regard themselves as atheists.
Right.
And saying it doesn't tell you necessarily
It's true.
one thing or the other.
It's true. She really cleverly, I think, uses it as a kind of throwaway phrase in the way that it's often used in contemporary society. But then, I don't know, oh my God, it can also be like how Hopkins was using it last time, right? That where it's like totally profound. But you're right, I think that that's, and she knows that too. I mean, I really think that that's an intentional possible reading, that it's a throwaway, but then you still have the, I should have dropped to my knees to thank God, right? So even if you take that out, I should have dropped to my knees to thank God you were alive, the God in whom I don't believe, you know, to take out the oh my. And you would still have, I think, a similar meaning. But I think you're right that she puts that in there almost as a way of saying this could be a throwaway phrase, you don't know. Matt?
I think it's also an event that speaks to the danger of believing in God. Right? These were, it wasn't a natural disaster, this was murder.
Right.
Was,
Oh, the danger of believing in God. Interesting. Well, that's part of the reason that it becomes difficult to believe in God, right? If you say religion caused this, it's harder.
But also she sees herself,
Right.
she sees herself exhibiting an element of belief.
Right.
And is almost scared.
Right. So the question is then, is she capturing exactly what she felt really, really, really on that moment, like on September 11th, or is this a month later where she knows more, right? She wrote the poem not that morning.
I understand.
Right. So you don't know.
You wouldn't want to react like that if, if in character.
If in the moment that she wouldn't have known, that's possible, yeah. I like it though, yeah. They didn't know it yet, yeah.
She doesn't say, I should have dropped to my knees to thank God you were alive, God in whom I don't believe. She said, oh my God.
Yeah.
So it's a deep feeling inside her that in her mind she doesn't really believe, but deep inside she does.
We're right, but it depends. It totally depends how you mean that, oh my. It depends how you mean that. If you mean it in the way that people say it all the time, all day long, and don't mean anything, then maybe not. And if you mean it like, oh my, then you do, right? But it's so much about what we bring to it. And I think that's one of the amazing things in this poem too, is that you just bring different things to it. And actually, I have to say, each time I read it, it feels a little different to me. So you have to go back to it another time and see if you have a different reaction. Okay, so last question. Is this a condition of modernity?
No.
No, it's always? People have always been like this? It's the human condition,
No,
right?
but it's funny, 35 years later, I'm reading the Odyssey. You know, again, Odysseus, the saddest man who ever lived, crying, it's who we are.
Okay, human condition.
Appreciate it.
Right. And my other question, and you don't have to answer these out loud, you can just think about them, because this is sort of, I think, the takeaway from reading a lot of these poems is this a problem? Right? Is it a problem for us to have this kind of ambiguity? So,
We have the book of Kohelet.
right? That's a good example.
The same kind of ambiguity.
Sure, absolutely.
We accept it as part of our canon.
Yeah, but we struggle with it.
Fine, but it's there. I mean, the
Right.
same kind of worries about,
Yeah.
nothing is permanent and there's no assurance and
Mhm.
we live the same life as animals and we're all going to wind up the same. What's the point of this? Let's do
Right.
that.
Okay,
And
Good.
he doesn't doubt the existence of God,
yeah.
but on the other hand,
Well,
it's almost a deistic kind of view.
right, it's not necessarily the view of God that we would want to teach our children. But I would
the setting
say,
here
but we do talk about,
emphasizes the point much more than Kohelet. We have all
for us maybe,
Right.
yeah, it depends who the reader is. But I do think maybe that some people think that Kohelet has a problem, right? We don't say that's the healthiest approach, do we? We should all live like Kohelet?
No.
Probably not usually.
Sof Devara Kol Nishma.
Yeah, but that's.
Right. So that's the question. Is this unique to us? Fred says no. Fred's the dean, I guess he knows. And is it a problem? And I'll just tell you in closing what my answer is. It's not a problem, it's great. I think it's great because one of the things I'm most thankful for in the world that I think about all the time is the nuance, right? The subtlety, the gray areas. That's what makes life interesting. It's not that we want disaster, but I don't think we want things handed to us too easily. And having to work some of these things out and feel like we're really small and we can't see the big picture and we don't know gives us something to strive for. And even knowing that it's actually unattainable, there's something really beautiful about that. So I think you could read all three of these poems and find them sort of depressing. And I don't at all. I find them really encouraging and exciting and inspiring. And all of the poems that we've read in these 3 weeks can be inspiring in that they give us new ways to think about our own place in the world and about all of that gray area that exists in between the binaries that actually don't exist. It's been a pleasure being with you, and I hope that this has been interesting and useful for you, and I'm happy to continue talking about poetry anytime with anyone. So thank you so much. Good night.